Great, thank you. I want to first start out by thanking Special Operations Command and Major General Miller, Stan, as well as the entire Sovereign Challenge team, Ken. I'm thanking you now. Hopefully I'll be thanking you at the end when we get those videos cranked up. But it's been a really interesting day. I appreciate all the interesting insights from hearing from people, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today. Now, when I was thinking about this, and the good news is you may be wondering, why am I talking about anti-smoking and how it relates to jihad? So in the spirit of Stan's guidance earlier, even if you disagree with everything I have to say, I would like you to focus on the positive message, which is smoking is bad, even if you don't think it can apply to a CVE realm. So let's see if this works. All right, and as an active duty officer, I got to put up the disclaimer that the views that are the crazy ideas you're going to hear out of my voice today are mine. They are mine alone. They don't represent my organization, the U.S. Military Academy, Department of Defense, or the United States government. So with that said, ironically, I want to tell you a little bit about my organization, the Combating Terrorism Center. And so this is a really unique organization that's based out of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And we have, what makes us unique is the sense that we are a primarily privately and independently funded research and education center at the Academy. And so it's populated by myself, a uniformed active duty officer, but predominantly a lot of civilian expertise, both master's degrees and PhDs. And so being primarily privately and independently funded gives us a lot of independence in order to do research that the government may not approve of or sanction. We don't get our ideas from our taskings from above. We have to come up with them with ourselves, which is sometimes a difficult problem to have. So in a lot of respects, we're like a private sector think tank. What makes us unique from a private sector think tank is our access to Tier 1 elite national level counterterrorism units within DoD and the interagency. And it's that combination of independence and access which I think really makes us a unique place. We have a three-pronged mission set. We teach, so we have an undergraduate minor where we teach cadets, but we also go outside the academy to teach practitioners within DoD as well as the interagency, to include the FBI, to include U.S. Army War College, as well as Tier 1 units like DevGru and Army Special Mission Units and Special Forces groups. We also conduct research, and again, that's how Stan, I think, found my name. It was, we produce a lot of major reports on topics relating to terrorism and counterterrorism, and we also produce a monthly journal called the CTC Sentinel, which you may have heard of. And as a byproduct of those things, we advise policymakers. So it's a really interesting place to work. I also should say out front that we've had a long-standing relationship with SOCOM. We have a joint program, which is for the DoD folks in here. It's run out of the J39 shop called the Harmony Program. And it's a really interesting program by which the CTC is able to leverage a lot of the captured battlefield documents that SOCOM is able to get their hands on, and then that information is then declassified and given to the CTC, and we're able to both do research on it as well as put that information up on the website for other scholars to use. Most famously, the first documents that were ever taken from the Abbottabad compound during the Osama bin Laden raid were released through the White House and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to my organization, the CTC. And if you're interested in looking at those documents, you can go take a look on our website, both in their native Arabic as well as translated forms. Really happy to talk about my organization later in the Q&A session, but first I wanted to share some of the insights that we learned from a popular and effective anti-smoking campaign that utilized a counter-industry approach. Now, the genesis of my talk today occurred last spring when my organization had a counterterrorism conference up at West Point, where we invited a lot of senior, both government and military officials. General Votel attended, General Thomas from JSOC attended, as well as representatives from FBI, NCTC, and these other organizations. But our goal was to really run a very different type of conference. We did not want to, the counterterrorism community is very small, and so we did not want to put those folks up on stage to brief everyone else, because if, being in the military, if you don't know what General Votel or General Thomas is thinking, then we're not doing our jobs. what we wanted to do was expose these types of senior CT leaders to experts that were in fields that were completely outside of counterterrorism, but that are facing problems and challenges that are very similar to the ones that we face in the counterterrorism community. And so, for example, on a panel where we focused on building partner capacity, we brought in the director from Doctors Without Borders to be a featured speaker. On another panel where we were talking about evaluating the metrics of counterterrorism, we brought in the head of analytics for an NHL hockey team. And on a panel discussing the war of ideas, which has been the topic du jour for today, we brought in the man pictured here to my left, your right, Mr. Pete Favat. He's the co-creator of the Truth anti-smoking campaign. That campaign, you may have seen, it's also in the news now, but it won in the decade of the 2000s, earned the top award. It was the top advertising campaign of that decade. Now, I don't have to tell the people in this room the importance of the war of ideas in our current fight. And I think and it's been said numerous times today, while we in the West understand and appreciate the importance of strategic communication in this struggle, we have ourselves struggled mightily in this specific domain. And as others have repeated today, most think that we have failed or are even losing. And it's interesting because, as the late Richard Holbrooke had once said at the outset, soon after 9/11, he said, why can't the United States, the world's leading communications society, do better in this fight? How are we losing to what he called a man in a cave, which he was referring to Osama bin Laden? So that's why we brought in Pete Favat to share his insights on what a counter-industry approach looked like. I think one of the things that you'll see is that some of the challenges that we face in the CVE realm is very similar to what the anti-smoking campaign was focusing. And Pete was just a really interesting character. You can't really see very well in this picture, but this was a very business-like conference, people dressed much like you all in here at West Point, which is a very conservative place. And Pete rolls in from, I think he's in Los Angeles, rolled off the plane. He's in jeans, he's wearing a flannel shirt, and I think he had a pair of Chuck Taylors on. So he definitely didn't fit in, but he wowed people with his insights. So adolescent smoking has been a persistent problem in the United States for a long period of time. And the anti-smoking public service advertisements in the past seem to have really little to no effect. And some of these campaigns were run by the government via public service announcements. Others were weak and watered down attempts by the tobacco companies themselves. But the one thing that they all had in common was that they failed to significantly curb teenage smoking. In fact, in one academic study that analyzed the effectiveness of this campaign called the Think Don't Smoke campaign, an effort which targeted both adolescents as well as their parents, they determined that the campaign not only failed, but it was actually counterproductive. And so while the ads targeting young people in trying to get them not to smoke did not have any demonstrable effect, it was interesting, the kids that had been exposed to the advertising aimed at the parents actually smoked more. And so not exactly the metrics of an effective anti-smoking campaign, to say the least. And so that's when Pete Favat was asked to take up the fight in 2000 from money that they had gotten from an out-of-court settlement between families and Big Tobacco. It was truly a David versus Goliath scenario. At the time, Big Tobacco was spending upwards to $13 billion per year on marketing, and they had surmised that the average 14-year-old at that time had been exposed to $20 billion worth of Big Tobacco marketing since they were the age of 6. And so in addition to that, Big Marketing also owned a lot of the most powerful brands in the consumer market, and they had essentially, if you remember back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of celebrity endorsers which made smoking look cool. And so, to say the least, Pete and his team were up against some pretty serious tall odds in reducing teenage smoking. And some thought that they were crazy when they came out and said, well, our goal is to actually, quote, out-brand Big Tobacco. And they were going to try to do so using a never-before-tried counter-industry approach. As Pete tells it, it was interesting when they finally decided on this approach. Here they had a room full of marketing and advertising professionals that had spent their entire careers trying to sell a product. And here they were, for the first time, trying to put their heads together to, quote-unquote, unsell a product. So how did they go about doing this? Well, ironically, they went back to the same research that Big Tobacco had used to market cigarettes to adolescents back in the 1950s and 1960s. They had relied on concepts for decades in their marketing campaign, especially how they market this stuff to kids. And so one of those concepts that they focused on was what psychologists call the age of assertion, the time in a child's life when their brains have developed to the point where they want to assert more control over their own decisions, as well as increase their own independence from their parents. And in conversations that we heard earlier today, some folks talk about this being the age of seeking identity and similar concepts. I think anybody in here that is either that just came from that age, or parents that have teenagers that are going through this age, it is definitely an interesting time in a child's life. So Big Tobacco also exploited the psychological need states of teenagers, specifically their desire to rebel, to take risks, to feel empowered and rebellious, as well as the desire to feel respected. And for a lot of those in here that have been studying the foreign fighter epidemic of late, those should sound like familiar concepts that today's folks are leaving their homes to include unprecedented numbers in the West to go fight for the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. Now, as Pete Favat likes to put it, these psychological need states are both global and they're consistent, and they hold true from Baghdad to Beijing. Now, to give you a taste of what the anti-smoking campaign used to look like before Pete's Truth campaign, take a look at this simple conceptualized graphic. Big Tobacco marketing is thought of to be in the upper right-hand quadrant. It was empowering, it was rebellious, it targeted the psychological need states that we saw on the last slide. They made smoking look cool and attractive. Now, on the other hand, the old anti-smoking campaigns in the 1990s and before were kind of conceptualized in that bottom left-hand quadrant. If you can recall the really ineffective Just Say No campaign, or the even more ridiculous Tobacco is Wacko hashtag line, you'll know what I mean when I talk about these things. They were preachy, they were controlling, and they really didn't resonate with the targeted audiences. So I want to show next a clip from that Think Don't Smoke campaign that was representative of those early anti-smoking efforts in the 1990s. I apologize in front for the cheesy music, the bad acting, and the really preachy undertone. If you could play that, Ken.
Hey, Christy!
Think smoking makes you look cool? No way.
What?
So I think everyone that sees that video, everyone agrees that the monkey was the best actor in that whole entire clip. So Pete's challenge was to make the Truth anti-smoking campaign more like Big Tobacco's. He had to make it empowering, he had to make it rebellious, and he had to make it, for lack of a better term, cool. The next clip is a good example of the type of marketing that Pete and his team put together. And I'd like you to pay particular attention to both the look, the feel, and the sound of that commercial, and how it is really markedly different from the preachiness of the previous commercial. The name of the next clip is called 1200, and it represents the 1,200 people who die every day as a result of smoking-related diseases. So let's take a look at that. And there's tons of other commercials that are like that. You can go to YouTube and take a look at them if you're interested. But they're all pretty much in that same, that's representative of most of them. Now, Pete was also a genius at guerrilla marketing rather, and the techniques associated with that to enhance the rebelliousness of the Truth brand. And so one of the things that they would do is the Truth brand would buy out centerfold 2-page advertisements in skate punk magazines and skateboard magazines. And what they would do is they would ask their fans then to go into prominent bookstores like Barnes & Noble or prominent magazine racks that get a lot of foot traffic, and then open that twofold advertisement up and then leave them on the racks. So when people would walk by, it was just kind of free marketing and free advertising for the folks that walked by. Second, there was also situations where they would go into an Apple store and encourage fans to go, kind of like it would be synonymous with flash mobs of today. And so they would have their fans go to each computer station in that Apple store and then go to a specific website, which was the Truth Campaign website, and then at one appointed time, everyone walk away and walk out of the store. So if you were coming into the store, all you would see is these very vibrant orange Truth campaigns on every single computer. It was edgy, it was cool, and it was effective. And finally, the Truth Campaign also put these little signs in magazines that highlighted the fact that ammonia, which is also found in dog feces, was also found in cigarettes. And so they encouraged their Truth fans to they had little cutouts of these signs, pluck them out, and then place them in dog poop around so that people would go, what is that? And go take a look, and it would be, explain that interesting factoid. And so it really did bring a lot of attention to the campaign. It was something that was pretty different and unique. So you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with counterterrorism or countering the narrative of jihadi groups like the Islamic State? No, I am not advocating a counter-narrative campaign utilizing and focusing around dog feces. I'll leave that to others if they want to do that. But in all seriousness, I think that when you take a look at the position that the Truth Campaign was against big tobacco, I think we are in a similar situation today when they started to outbrand big tobacco. The enemy, if you take a look at this graphic, is now occupying that space in the upper right-hand quadrant. They have the brand that is generally seen by youth to be more empowering, more rebellious, and cooler to the younger generation, as evidenced again by those thousands of Westerners that are flocking to Syria and Iraq. We, I would argue, though, are largely trying to outbrand the Islamic State from that preachy and controlling angle. In fact, there are a lot of similarities between the failed slogan in the 1990s that I brought up earlier and that previous anti-smoking campaign, which was Think, Don't Smoke, and today's slogan used by the U.S. government, which is Think Again, Turn Away. And so I'm definitely not here to disparage the great work that's being done by state and other elements in this public diplomacy domain. There's certainly some great stuff being done, but I would just argue that we need to be more creative, we need to be more agile, and we potentially need to be more risque when it comes to outbranding our enemy. That's why it's interesting to be hearing some of the stuff from the Adventures Partners campaign, because I think that's the direction that we need to move. I think we can do better. I taught a class last spring on U.S. efforts to counter the jihadist threat, and in doing so I showed them the U.S. government's Twitter feed, again, that Think Again, Turn Away. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that Twitter feed, the State Department pumps out overt content that's attributed to the U.S. government and the State Department in this sphere, and its intent is a CVE-driven intent. Now, not making things up, but this story was one of the prominent stories that appeared on that day. And it's about a man who, I think he was living in Raqqa, Syria. He had fled Syria because of the Islamic State coming in, and he had returned several months later in order to find that the cat that he had left behind when he was forced to flee was still living in his home. Now, I don't know if there's more to the story. I don't know if the cat had become radicalized since his departure. And I'm very happy for both the cat and I'm happy for the man, but I don't think that this is the type of influential content that is going to sway future jihadists from waging jihad. I think we can and we should do better. So before I close, I want to emphasize that I'm here to tell you there's obvious, major, and important differences between efforts to reduce teenage smoking and efforts to reduce people from trying to wage jihad. But I definitely think there are several takeaways and lessons learned that can help us in today's counter-narrative fight. First, the Truth Campaign felt that if advertising had played an influential role in getting kids to smoke, which it obviously did, then advertising could also help in the fight against teenage smoking. I believe the same thing is true today in countering violent extremism and the foreign fighter threat. This is not to say that a counter-industry approach like the one that Pete Favat put up there is going to completely eliminate radicalization or stop the tide of foreign fighters from entering Syria and Iraq, but I think it will be a significant improvement over our current efforts. I'm also well aware that the United States has tried some of this stuff before in the public diplomacy sphere, trying to connect with Madison Avenue folks in order to help project and improve our image in campaigns directed at the Middle East, which I think many would argue that those programs have been less than effective, but the government hasn't, to my knowledge, employed a counter-industry approach or contacted people like Pete Favat of the world, and I think it should. When I first called Pete Favat to come to West Point to go to a counterterrorism conference, he almost hung up on me because he thought I was pranking him. He really thought I was kidding, and it was interesting to see that how after he was at the conference, he was totally willing to help us in the fight, but he had not been reached out to as of yet. And that's why we wrote the article to shed some more light on this. Now, the last point I want to make before we open up to questions is, and I think this might be the most important point, is the Truth Campaign succeeded partly because it was perceived to be made by kids for kids. And I emphasize perceived because it was actually middle-aged people like Pete Favat who were tapping into the look, the feel, and the vibe of the younger generation, and they got it right. In fact, when the first couple Truth commercials were aired, including some that were even more provocative than the one that I showed, the Truth Campaign started receiving hundreds of complaints from parents, from teachers, from administrators that were calling Pete's corporate bosses and complaining about this campaign. Now, counterintuitively, Pete was actually happy about all the criticism that he was receiving from parents, and he was happy that the corporate suits were not seeing the way that he was seeing them. And as it was mentioned, I forget when it was mentioned up here, but to Pete, if the adults didn't like the commercials, then that was actually a good thing. That was actually a metric of success because the kids got it. And that was the only thing that was important to Pete, the only thing that mattered. Now, many have critiqued the United States government's efforts in countering that jihadi narrative because, again, it's too slow, it's too cumbersome, it's too bureaucratic, it's arguably too conservative, not to mention the fact that these types of programs, like the one that State Department runs with the digital outreach team and SCCE, are, in my opinion, not very well funded. Not a lot of attention is paid to them. But the good news, like you heard today, I think the State Department, DOD, and other organizations are moving in the right direction and trying to tap into that younger vibe to come up with the ideas that you heard about earlier today. And I'm here to say that we're proud that I was one of the other folks on the other end of Tony's phone call, and so West Point is one of the organizations of the 43 that's doing this initiative right now, and so I'm leading that class and very excited to have our own crack at the piñata to see if we can do any better. So really excited about that. I want to thank everyone again for their time and happy to take your questions now.